Hello everyone, bună ziua tuturor. I'm going to speak English. Welcome to our Translating Europe workshop. My name is Carmen Toma. I am the DG Translation Field Officer in Romania. I work for the European Commission. I just want to start with a very important technical detail. We have interpretation available in English, Polish, and Romanian, so you can choose your channel. I will, however, speak English just to avoid relay interpretation, which causes some sort of delay if we use interpretation from English into Romanian and then from Romanian into English. And then our Polish interpreters take over into Polish, so I will speak English. I would like to also mention that we will have today presentations, but also Q&A sessions after each presentation. And I'd like to invite you to use the Q&A session instead of the chat session to ask questions to our speakers, because it is harder to follow the chat when there are many people writing. It's easier to use the Q&A because we have pop-up numbers telling us how many questions there are. About our event today, it is a Translating Europe workshop. It's part of the Translating Europe project of the European Commission, which was launched in 2014 and brings together translation stakeholders such as universities, the language industry, language institutes, translation services of the public sector in the member states, and professional associations. Translating Europe aims at linking public and private translation stakeholders together. We're aiming at giving visibility to the translation profession or to the language professions in general and exchange good practices. So the Translating Europe project consists of two parts. One annual event, the Translating Europe Forum, organized by the European Commission in Brussels, or hybrid event since the pandemic. This year, the forum will take place in November between the 9th and the 11th. You can already register. It will be called Access for All, going beyond translating text. And the second part of the Translating Europe project consists of Translating Europe workshops, such as our workshop today, organized in the member states with partners of DG Translation of the European Commission. So about our Translating Europe workshop, I would like to start by thanking all the speakers who have been so generous and volunteered to share their expertise with us. This event is organized in partnership with PSBT, the Polish Association of Translation Companies. Before moving on to the presentations, I'd like to say hello and give the floor to the president of PSBT, Ms. Monica Popiolek, for a brief introduction. Ms. Popiolek.
Hello, everybody. My name is Monica Popiolek, and as the president of the Polish Association. Hello? Hello, can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Yes. Okay, so once again, as the president of the Polish Association of Translation Companies and the co-organizer of this event, I would like to welcome all of you today, and I hope that you will find this event interesting and informative. And I also hope that you will participate in the Q&A sessions and contribute as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Ms. Popiolek is also our keynote speaker, and she has been president of the MART Agency Limited since 1991 and president of the Polish Polish Associations of Translation Companies since 2009. She has a master's in modern languages from the University of Warsaw, and she also has an executive MBA. It was a joint program including Warsaw University of Technology Business School, London Business School, HEC Paris, NHH Bergen, and she has also started with a PhD program, and then she completed by transferring her PhD dissertation at the Warsaw University. She started at the Warsaw School of Economics, and then she transferred her dissertation at the Warsaw University. Her research specialization in strategic quality management and standards completes this very rich professional background. She has been a translator, a sworn translator and interpreter since 1998. Ms. Popiolek is also an ISO standards auditor trainer. She's an author of several certification schemes, chair of the Polish Committee for Standardization, General Issues and Management Systems Sector. She's been chair of the PKN Technical Committee 256 on Language Terminology, Translation and Interpreting, ISO TC 37 Mirror Committee since 2008. She's also the head of the Polish National Delegation to ISO TC 37, as well as OASIS, ISO and SEN expert. She has a number of industry and academic publications on translation standards, quality assurance, strategic quality management and terminology, and has presented all the leading industry conferences, LOC World, TECOM, ATA, TM Europe, ATC, EU ATC. Of course, she's attended the European Commission's Translating Europe forums and workshops, and she has attended many biannual conferences, points of view biannual conferences, etc. She is affiliated with many language and business organizations, such as PSBT and TPIS, ATA TCD Leadership Council. She's a member. She's a member of the KYG Council. She is a member of the TC 37 Steering Committee, SAA, MBA, and We Connect, Rotary Club Poland, among others. She specializes in all the key industry standards. She was one of the editors for the ISO 17100 in 2015 standard on the requirements for the translation services. And she's project leader for ISO 2771 in 2020 on legal translation requirements. Ms. Popiolek, you have the floor.
Monica, yourself.
I've unmuted myself, yes, but I'm going to share my screen with you now. Just a second. Is it working? Okay, let's see. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so my keynote today is an overview of ISO 18587, which is an ISO standard on the post-editing of machine translation output requirements. And I had to, but Carmen has already spoken at length about my various roles and well, achievements as well, I suppose. So I'm not going to repeat all this. I'm going to start off with some context here. My presentation, when I was drafting the final version, changed a little bit, because normally what would happen is I would give you an overview of the standard, and I would just more or less tell you what is in the standard and what is important from the point of view of general usage, certification, and so on. In this case, I'm also going to do a bit of that, but it is important to understand that my perspective on standards is based on several caveats. And one caveat is that because I wear many hats, I look at the big picture, and at the same time, I'm very much focused on details, such as drafting of standards and whatever. That is because I not only have to manage the process within the Polish committee, and I have to comment on standards and whatever, but I also actually author standards, and I edit those standards. And then what is worse, I also author the certification schemes for standards. And then after that's done, I have to train the auditors for those standards. And the auditors are not from our industry. And as you can imagine, it's quite a challenge to try and explain to people from outside our industry how the industry works and why we do things the way we do, and why certain standard requirements are not really easily, let's say, identifiable, and it's difficult to, for example, provide proof of fulfillment of certain requirements. So I'm very much focused on the logic, the consistency, and the wording of standards, and that's why some of parts of this presentation might sound a little bit critical, because this standard is a big challenge. And the second thing that's happened very recently that changed my let's say idea for this presentation is that this will not be a typical overview, because the standard is now under revision within ISO, which basically means that the standard is going to change over the next, let's say, 2 years probably. And because of this, and because of the fact that it's not going to be the same standard in a very short time, obviously this requires a different sort of explanation and some relevant context to explain why exactly it needed to be revised so soon. Of course, 5 years is not so soon from some people's perspective, but from the ISO perspective, 5 years is quite soon, because some standards are confirmed as up to date, for example, for 15 years. And in this case, after 5 years, we had to make a decision to change it. And there are very good reasons for this. So, okay, some more context then. ISO TC 37, which basically means ISO Technical Committee 37, established Subcommittee 5 to deal with translation, interpreting, and related technologies in 2011. This is quite important because previously the whole translation industry working group was under sort of, linguistic terminology subcommittees, and it was a bit of an elephant and an ant situation, where a huge industry was pushed into a smaller sort of container of a working group. So we established a separate subcommittee to deal with our industry standards, and work began in 2011. Very early on, because in 2012, this standard was proposed as a new work item proposal. That's ISO wording for it. So this standard for post-editing of machine translation was offered basically as a proposal in 2012. And it was accepted in spite of certain opposition, because it was deemed that the standard was quite premature at that time, but it was still accepted. It was developed, and it was finally published in 2017. And as for background information about certain issues that surrounded this, the development of this standard, because it was developed between 2012 and 2017, At the time, machine translation technology and processes were changing very rapidly. And these changes became even more dynamic after 2017 because of the huge uptake of MT on the market. By huge uptake, I mean that machine translation is more and more popular on the market. So technology is changing very dramatically. So a decade ago, some experts presumed that, for example, the main stakeholders for machine translation plus post-editing would be translation companies and their clients. They thought that this would be the natural course, that basically it was between the translation company and the client to decide how this work was going to be done. And also the typical machine translation plus post-editing workflow would be at the time to translate the whole file using an MT engine. And usually this engine would be some sort of an on-site customized system or whatever. And at the pre-production stage, this would be done, and you'd have something that would be referred to as raw machine translation. And then you would get the post editor to revise the raw MT output manually or within some CAT tool possibly. And at the post-production stage, what people thought would be that there would be feedback from the post-editors, and this feedback could be used, for example, to train the machine translation engine. That was the concept at the time. Today, as we all know, the main machine translation stakeholders are actually individual translators. And since the advent of neural machine translation, most machine translation is actually sourced from public online servers via plugins in CAT tools. So whatever you want to call this system of work or this way of accessing machine translation, it is definitely not an environment where an individual translator or an individual translation company has control of this process. That's quite an important point, and I'll get back to that later. So, today the post editor uses a CAT tool 90% of the time, as far as I was able to discern, to edit the segments, taking into account suggestions from translation memories and the machine translation engine. So this is quite a different way of looking at it than what was basically envisaged 10 years ago. And ISO 18587 does not cover this typical scenario of today. It focuses on competences and qualifications of post-editors and general guidelines for full post-editing. So a little bit about what is actually included in ISO 18587. The structure of the standard is more or less same as other standards in our industry, because it was based heavily on ISO 17100. So the logic and the structure is more or less the same. And it's every single standard, basically, if you know ISO standards, and every single one starts with an introduction. And then there are terms and definitions, and then in this case, well, the scope before that, of course, which is part of the introductory clauses. And then you've got terms and definitions, and in this case, pre-production, production, post-production stages. And then you've got the description of competencies and qualifications of post-editors, and then some requirements for full post-editing, and then the annexes. And as for introduction scope, introduction is not a normative element of the standard, and scope is. In other words, that means that even if you didn't have much in the introduction, or maybe nothing at all even, it wouldn't matter so much, because the introduction is supposed to introduce the context and explain why the standard was developed and why it is important, for example. At least it should. And as I said, the introduction section is informative and not normative. And the introduction here, the introduction to ISO 18587, does not explicitly state that the main stakeholders are translation service providers, understood as translation companies, but it says just translation service providers, which could mean any sort of translation service provider offering MT post-editing services. However, if you read the introduction and you read the whole standard, it becomes clear that it was mainly intended actually for translation companies. And the logic applied to the standard was that of a translation company. It is also stated in the introduction that it is not intended as a standard for machine translation systems because these are changing too rapidly. And that is true. The standard says very little about machine translation as such. It is also stated that, and this is a quote, there is no MT system with an output which can be qualified as equal to the output of human translation, and therefore the final quality of the translation output still depends on human translators, and for this purpose, their competence in post-editing. And this is quite a general statement that may or may not be true, or may have been true at that time. But the quality of translation machine has dramatically improved since then. And the machine translation versus human translation debate has now become truly interesting because there are a lot of factors that you need to take into account, such as, for example, the domain, the purpose of the document. Anyway, nowadays, if you asked in a survey, for example, whether the machine translation system can be qualified as nearly equal to or equal to the output of human translation, you would get a lot of different answers. Some of them would say that yes, it can be comparable for certain language pairs or certain situations, for example. And the scope, as I mentioned before as well, is normative, and in theory at least, it should state what is within and what is outside the scope of the standard. In other words, it should say what the standard covers and what it does not cover, and what is, in other words, it's outside of the standard. So, for example, if you look at the scope of 17100, it clearly states that we are talking about human translation services, and that machine translation is outside of the scope of 17100. This is an example of a clear, a clear message that the scope provides to the market. And in case of the ISO 18587, the scope is really concise, and it just includes the following: that this document provides requirements for the process of full human post-editing of machine translation output and post-editors' competencies, that this document is intended to be used by translation service providers, their clients, and post-editors, and that it is only applicable to content processed by MT systems. So I've made those little notes on my slides because I want you to see the way I'm sort of trying to have some sort of a dialogue situation with what is actually in the standard, and to suggest different ways of looking at this. So here, in other words, the scope says that the standard only covers full human machine translation post-editing, that it applies only to machine translation pre-processed content, which basically means raw MT, and that the focus is on post-editors' competencies rather than the process itself, right? So then we have the section for terms and definitions. This is also a standard section. You'll find it in every ISO standard. And as for terminology, what happened a few years into the work done within SC5, which is the subcommittee for translation, as I mentioned before, translation, interpreting, and whatever, is that we realized that because different leaders were responsible for the development of different standards, and the work was not done in a very uniform way. In other words, we all follow ISO guidelines, but we don't necessarily communicate and use the same resources the way we should. We established a terminology coordination group in order to be consistent with our terminology across all of the industry standards. And this has really helped, actually. And the terminology coordination group has worked very hard on all of the key standards that we have been producing within SC5. And since the publication of ISO 18587, some of the standard terms have been revised, and their definitions, of course, have been revised by the TCG. And all of those terms, industry terms, are published in a separate standard, which is ISO 20539. And there you can see the most up-to-date definitions for our standard industry terminology. So in case of ISO 18587, the terminology section includes, for example, those categories and terms that are considered key for this particular standard. So we have concepts related to machine translation, including definitions of what is machine translation output, what is post-editing, what is full post-editing, and so on. And then we have concepts related to language and content, and then concepts related to the people involved in translation services. And this, for example, in this case, includes post-editor, because the others are obviously the same for all of our industry standards. I'm talking here about concepts like translator, interpreter, whatever. And then we have concepts related to translation. And this, for example, includes human translation versus machine translation versus translation memory, and so on. And if you compare this standard with 17100, you will see that, well, I would say 80% of the definitions are taken from 17100. And some of them are totally similar or the same even, and some of them are slightly modified, and this creates some issues. So to continue with the structure of the standard, we go on to the pre-production phase, and in the pre-production phase, the standard states that the TSP shall have a process in place to determine, in consultation with the client when necessary, whether the source language content is suitable for MT, for example. And there's one note here. I'm sure most of you are aware of how ISO standards are not only developed, but what are the guidelines for our ISO standards and what is the meaning of certain terms. But in this case, if the clause says shall, that means it's a requirements clause. So in other words, shall in ISO standards has the meaning of must, has to, and whatever, as opposed to should, which is a guidance clause. So in other words, it would be good if. So this is a shall clause. So this is one of the first requirements. So there has to be a process in place to figure out whether the MT is suitable, the content is, the source language content is suitable for MT. And then the TSP shall again finalize agreements with each client and retain a record of such agreements. And this includes dealing with the deviations from the original agreement and so on. In other words, when you agree on something and then you decide to change the agreement, there has to be a process for this and some sort of a record of this, of course. And the TSP shall then ensure that the requirements for the post-editing project are identified, documented, and accessible to the post-editor. This is an interesting point because this is a requirement, but the problem with this requirement is that the standard doesn't specify how this should be happening. In other words, the standard doesn't say in what way would the TSP notify the post editor of all this? And then the next point is that the TSP shall ensure that the relevant specifications, for example, about the quality level, target audience, and so on, are communicated with appropriate examples to the post editor, and they are observed. So once again, they are supposed to be communicated, but the standard doesn't give any guidance on how this should be done and what are the best methods of doing this. I'll maybe mention it later on again. And in the pre-production stage, that the TSP shall also ensure that the source language content and the text to be post-edited are available in appropriate format for use by the post-editor. In other words, the TSP has to figure out in what form the post-editor is going to access this content and what sort of a working environment the post-editor should have. And then the TSP shall ensure that the post-editor has access to all the reference materials and any relevant resources for post-editing. Once again, guidance is not provided on how this should happen, whether, for example, this could be done within a CAD tool or there's some other method. And then the TSP shall also inform the post-editor of the level of estimated usefulness of the post-edited MT output. In other words, the TSP should enter into some sort of a dialogue with the post-editor to determine how useful this MT output, raw translation, machine translation output, how useful it is for the job of post-editing. And this is the TSP's responsibility, which is important. And then the TSP shall also ensure that the output to be post-edited includes indications, marks to correctly distinguish between MT output and output from other translation sources. And this is another interesting point, because if this is true, then actually the process described here, which is basically you can do it any way you want, does not reflect this, because if you can do it any way you want, then in most cases, if, for example, you give the translator a file and you tell him to start post-editing, there's no easy way to distinguish between the source. I mean, how do you show the translator on a file whether this suggestion or this segment comes from MT or from TM or some other source? So this is a tricky one. And the production stage is where the production process is supposed to be described. So it says here that in the standard that the TSP shall ensure that post-editors always meet the following objectives in the post-editing process. And in other words, the TSP shall, which is a requirements clause, ensure that the post-editor does the following, but it doesn't say how this is supposed to be happening once again. But anyway, the TSP shall ensure that the post-editor basically makes the output comprehensible, that it corresponds to the source language content. Well, in other words, the target language content corresponds to the source language content, which makes sense, of course. And it complies with post-editing requirements and specifications defined by the TSP, except that, as I said before, there is no real method by which the TSP is obliged to communicate all those things to the post-editor. At least it's not indicated in the standard. And there should be some guidance, I think, in this respect. And then the TSP shall ensure that the following requirements are also met. And there is a whole list. Well, this is about terminological and lexical consistency, use of standard syntax, compliance with any applicable standards. By the way, compliance is not used correctly here. because compliance is with regulations, and I will mention this later as well. Correct formatting, suitability for the target audience, and compliance with client TSP agreements, and so on. So the problem here is that not only compliance is used incorrectly, and basically, given the fact that this is an ISO context, this shouldn't happen. But it is also not clear how these requirements that are TSP requirements, in other words, the TSP has to fulfill or meet those requirements, affect and are communicated by the TSP to the post editor. So this is the third list of things that are expected to happen, but the standard doesn't tell us how they're exactly expected to happen, or how at least they should be dealt with. And then we have those post-editors tasks and some other obvious issues here, because the TSP shall also ensure that the following tasks are performed by the post-editor. So the onus here is on the post-editor. And it says here that the TSP shall ensure that the post-editor reads the empty output and evaluates whether a reformulation of the, in other words, post-editing of the target language content is necessary. Reformulation, post-editing, right? So now it turns out at this point that actually, in spite of the fact that the TSP was supposed to enter into a dialogue with the post editor beforehand to see whether it would work, whether it could be done like this. Now the post editor is expected to read this machine translation output and evaluate first whether it basically can, whether it needs to be post edited. It seems that the sequence here is slightly wrong, and it seems that it's difficult to see how, this once again could be done, because this is not the point where, as far as I can see, the post editor can come back to the TSP and say, well, actually, you know what, post editing of this content is not necessary at all. Let's not do it. That basically is impossible, of course. And the TSP shall also ensure that the post editor shall use the source language content as reference in order to understand and, if necessary, correct the target content. Well, once again, you know, as I said in the first point with point A, if ISO deals with full post edit, if this ISO standard deals with full post editing, then the post editor's evaluation to determine if any post editing of the target content is necessary is a bit pointless. And then secondly, if a post editor doesn't actually use the source language content as, well, the post editor cannot actually use the source language content as reference, which is point B, because it is the source text for the translation. So it's not a reference. It's the source text for the final product, because there's a source and a target, right? So this is very awkward wording. And the third one is the requirement that the post editor produces target language content either from existing elements in the machine output or provides a new translation. Well, this is also inconsistent with what the standard is supposed to be doing, because if we are talking about post-editing, then why are we suddenly suggesting that actually the post-editor should be doing some translation from scratch if it's necessary? It would suggest, at least in this case, that perhaps the content is not suitable for this sort of exercise, that it shouldn't actually be post-edited if it requires serious translation. And also another thing which I notice, maybe somebody else wouldn't notice, is that the definition of post-editor provided in this standard clearly indicates that a post-editor edits and corrects machine translation output. So there is no way that the post-editor should be now producing target language content, because he doesn't produce or she doesn't produce, but they're supposed to be editing and correcting it, nothing more. So the question that sort of naturally arises here is, how are all of these, I've been, showing you 3 or 4 slides of TSP requirements. Some of them are sort of dumped on the post editor. But anyway, how are those TSP requirements? How do they translate into specific service tasks? And how are they communicated to the post editor? Is it some sort of a brief that the post editor should be getting, or a specification, like you have a client TSP specification? You could also do the same, and you can call it brief. Sometimes it is called brief, sometimes it's called specifications. You could provide the post editor with this. You could provide the post editor with checklists, for example, where all the tasks would be listed. But the problem is that the standard doesn't say anything about this really. And then in the post-production phase, you've got the final verification and delivery. That's the same as in 17100. Basically, the TSP has to have a process in place for verification of the final product. This does not mean revision. It does not mean that somebody comes and revises the post-edited product. It means that a project manager basically checks against specifications or agreement with the client if everything has been done correctly before the translation is released, or the post-edited output is released for delivery to that client. And then there's an interesting point here about feedback, because feedback is necessary, we all know that. And in 17100, there's quite a lot of stress placed on the fact that feedback is one of the ways in which you improve a process and you improve the quality of translation. And in this case, it says here that the TSP shall have a process in place to obtain feedback from post editors on the performance of the MT system, not on the quality or lack thereof, or of the content, but on the performance of the MT system, which is quite a different thing, because the MT system could be trained to deal with certain types of things and not other types of things, or it could be used in this way or that way. So anyway, this is a weird sort of way of putting it. And the second thing is that it says here that when appropriate, the post editor should provide input towards the improvement of the MT system used and process followed. And this is completely, well, maybe not completely, but rather unrealistic today, because of the way that those MT systems are used. Of course, it will be further discussed in the conclusions. I mean, I will mention it in the conclusions, but of course, it's as if you could imagine working as a translator using, I don't know, the worst possible example, maybe using a Google Translate, right? And then you prepare feedback for Google and you send it to Google saying how they, should improve their machine translation system. You can imagine that it might be quite challenging to do that, right? In the competence and qualifications section, you have competencies of post editors that are literally copied from the competences of translators as set in ISO 17100. It's exactly the same thing: translation competence, linguistic and textual competence, and so on, competence in research, information acquisition and processing, cultural competence, technical competence, domain competence. So it's an exact copy from the translator competences, and the qualifications are exactly the same as well. So in other words, we have a standard on post-editing, and we are talking about a new role, which is the role of post-editor, but we are actually transferring all the competencies and all the qualifications that are required from a translator. Which begs the question, why do we have to have a new name for an old job, right? But I'll try and sum it up later as well. So there is a section also about additional professional requirements. And I was being so slightly sarcastic here when I said reality check in the box on the left, because in this clause, it says that post-editors shall apply a professional approach towards the post-editing tasks. So in other words, we are talking about a requirements clause that is based on wishful thinking, because it doesn't say here, how are we going to ensure this? It only says that they shall apply this professional approach. And they should have a general knowledge of MT technology, knowledge of cut tools, knowledge and ability to establish whether editing MT output makes sense, and so on, and the ability to follow instructions received, and so on and so on. Post-editors should, this is a should clause, so it's not a requirement, it's a recommendation, have the ability to provide structured feedback on frequently recurring errors in MT output, contributing to the improvement of the MCT system over time. Once again, the same point I made before. Whether this is actually realistic in today, and given the fact that the processes have changed for dealing with this service. And the last one is that post-editors should have a general understanding of how terminology management systems interact with MT systems. This is really vague as well. So the wording of this clause is quite misleading, because as we saw before, and the way that the scope defines the purpose of this standard, it is actually the TSP that is required to have a process in place to prove conformity with the standard requirements. And this responsibility cannot be transferred like this to the post-editor, because there is no way that the TSP can ensure that this actually happens. And also research shows that post-editors, I recently checked a lot of the new publications on this topic, and there's a lot of research going on actually. And it shows that post-editors should actually have more competence and experience than translators, and that the focus here should be revision competence. Because they should be able to quickly evaluate the TM output, but not because of a decision about whether to do post-editing or not to do post-editing, because that is a function of the purchase order that they get from the TSP. If they are told to do post-editing, then there's no point going back and saying, actually, I don't think I should be doing this, but of course, everything can happen. But they have to be able to evaluate the TM output in order to manage their work. For example, to decide that they need 10 hours or 20 hours or 3 days or 1 week, and that it needs more effort or less effort, and so on and so forth. And also they should be able to, of course, classify and correct all sorts of errors, because this is their job, and any inconsistencies, but without falling into the traps of what we call over-editing and under-editing of the machine translation output. And they should have a strong competence in the required domain or specialization, of course, because just because it is machine translation, it doesn't mean that specializations and domains no longer play any role in the final translation product. And of course, in terms of terminology research, they should be able to research terminology in order to check whether this is the correct terminology used, rather than, as it says above, some general understanding of how term basis or terminology interacts within machine translation systems, because a post editor doesn't necessarily have to know how terminology management systems interact with MT systems, because this is a technical issue or a functionality issue, but they definitely have to know how to fix the terminology if it's wrong. And also nowadays, 90% of machine translation work is done using public online servers. So this is my point that I made previously. Once again, if those servers are not individual customized systems, such as, for example, I used to have in my, I don't know, IT server room, then there is really no justification for the requirement that the post editor is responsible for improving such an empty system by providing a certain type of feedback, structured or otherwise. And the requirements of full post editing, this is also a very short part of the standard, and there's not much guidance provided here. But basically, the point is that the output shall be accurate, comprehensible, stylistically adequate with correct syntax, grammar, and punctuality. And the aim of this level of post-editing is to produce an output which is indistinguishable from human translation. This is interesting because at this point, it is very clear that the standard was actually developed in order to promote full post editing as some sort of a value added service. Well, not some sort of a value added service, but as a service that is slightly cheaper, perhaps, than human translation, and is a good alternative if you have to deal with big volumes and you need to lower the rates for translation. But light post editing is treated here just as some sort of an example of what could happen if you don't have full post editing. In other words, there are lots of risks associated with it, right? So this light post editing is treated here as some sort of an alternative, but the focus is fully on full post editing, and this is proposed as the best practice. This way of dealing with it. But the wording here is once again misleading, because it is not the output's job to do anything, because it says here the output shall. It means that the requirement is for the output to be accurate, comprehensible, and stylistically adequate. But an output cannot do anything. It is the TSP's job to ensure that something is done properly and that there is a process in place. And the requirements of full post editing include things like ensuring that no information has been accidentally added or omitted, editing, and so on and so forth. But there are lots of things that could be done, of course, but the above lists a lot of tasks that are typically performed by revisers. So the question is if those focal points are not even totally relevant sometimes, because, for example, if you're working on machine translation post-editing within a CAT tool, there's no way you'll be really worried about formatting rules and things like, I don't know, spelling, because this is dealt with in that particular environment. And once again, misleading wording, because from the fact that the post editor shall focus on something, and this is what it says, or anything else, does not mean that the TSP has fulfilled a standard requirement. So it's very difficult. And I'm making this point because it's so difficult to create a certification system if you have this sort of wording, where you cannot really say who is supposed to be accountable and who is supposed to have a process and who is responsible for what. The annexes, that's an easy part, because all of them are informative here. They could be informative or normative, but all of them are informative here. The problem with them is that they're also very general and they don't really provide any relevant know-how or guidance on how things could be done, because you can imagine that in the body of the standard, certain things are sort of indicated, but you don't have to go into details. But then in the annex, you could provide examples, for example, right? And I find that Annex D is really problematic because I understand that things change and maybe certain things could not be specified at that point in time. But this Annex D, it's about agreements and project specifications, and our industry has a lot of best practice on this. So in Annex D, for example, I would have expected some universal contractual provisions that might be helpful. For example, some indication about SLA, which is the service level agreement, indication of how to define acceptable quality of machine translation output if it is to be post-edited. Some risks related with doing translation while using, machine translation raw output and then post-editing it. Communication issues. How do you communicate when you're a client and a TSP, and how do you ensure that your vendors or post-editors or whatever actually know what is supposed to happen with this service and how it's supposed to be performed according to client specification. This is missing, unfortunately. So I would like to conclude, and there are a lot of conclusions maybe here, but some of them are perhaps more important than others. Basically, the big picture is that when we were developing 17100, we had a lot of best practice that it was based on. So it is really a great example of a successful standardization project. And I'm not only saying this because I was one of the editors, and I'm not, laying praise on myself, but the document, if you read it carefully, sets clear requirements for professional TSPs, provides guidance and best practice. And under most circumstances, you can assume that the translation end product, which is the result of such a service done according to the process described in 17100, would be considered a good quality product. And in my experience, after 15 years or so working with ISO standards, every successful industry standard always reflects best practice. It has to reflect best practice. And clear standard requirements have to translate into a good certification scheme. If there are no clear standard requirements, then it's very difficult to develop a good certification scheme. And this basically contributed to the success of 17100. In case of another standard that is very close to my heart, because I was the project leader and the main author for this standard, 27771, we followed the same principle. The document covers relevant best practice for specialized translation this time, which is legal translation, and it plays a very significant role in promoting professionalism because it includes a lot of very useful clauses for development, security, confidentiality, all sorts of issues. And that is why 27771 can also be used for a good certification scheme and certification of individual legal translators. By the way, because 27771 is intended only for individuals, there are no certification schemes in place, and nobody can claim to certify against the standard yet, because certification for individuals is based on different rules than certification for entities. So I'm making this point because I've seen some weird claims on the market. If somebody claims to be certified against 27771, then there's something wrong with this. In other words, no, if a company claims to be certified against 27771, then it's impossible because it's intended only for individuals. Okay, anyway, 18587 aimed to achieve similar goals as those other standards that I've mentioned, but the scope was unclear, as I sort of commented before. The timing was off because it was done at a time when certain things were just beginning to change fast. And the main strategy was actually to promote a certain status quo. In other words, to promote a certain image of how this should be done. And this turned out to be quite unrealistic, given the changes, the dynamic changes, and what actually happened with best practice in terms of post-editing of machine translation. And that is why I'm unhappy to have to say this, but ISO 18587 is not a successful certification standard, in spite of the fact that I tried hard to develop a more or less good scheme for it. Anyway, some issues with ISO 18587 stem from the fact that it was developed at that particular time, and technology and the related processes were still undergoing so many changes. And it was the project leaders pushed for the standard prematurely, but it can also be fixed, so it's not such a big deal. And the problem also was that in those circumstances, people didn't have enough know-how. The experts didn't have enough know-how to really address a standard like this. And let's hope that this time round we will be able to get more experts who specialize in MT plus post-editing on board. There are several people who even at that time could have probably predicted how MT plus post-editing would be developing on the market. I think that, I don't know, maybe Andy Way would have known if he had been involved in the standard. Sharon O'Brien definitely was a big expert on post-editing, but unfortunately her comments were not taken into account at the early stages. It's difficult to say what would have been, but this time round, I hope we'll get the right experts and that all the changes will reflect actual industry best practice. The definition of post-editing, that's an important point, because the definition of post-editing used in ISO 18587 was copied from 17100, but without the note that is in 17100. And in that note, it is specified that the use by a translator of MT suggestions within a cut tool does not actually constitute post-editing of machine translation. That is just the use of suggestions. So this created a lot of unnecessary misunderstandings about the scope and the use of MT and whatever. So some companies that have certified against the standard really try to stop translators from using machine translation plugins within their CAD tools. Also, another problem is that ISO 18587 does not cover machine-aided human translation. There is a category that's called machine-aided human translation, which is more or less what I described now, where a human uses suggestions from various sources. And now this seems to be the main model for machine translation plus post-editing. So this is quite a problem when a standard doesn't address the main model. As I said, the problem is also what translators should be doing or what they can't be doing. And in the age of, I don't know if you're all familiar with this term that's been coined, I think 5 or 10 years, maybe even ago, but when we were talking about the future and visions for the future of how translation would develop, there was a term coined, I can't remember who was the author, of the augmented translator. I think it might have been, it doesn't matter. Well, anyway, the augmented translator is, at that time, we thought it was the translator of the future, because it was a translator, it was supposed to be a translator who used technology extensively and used suggestions from any sources in order to translate. And the problem here is that one might argue that what is actually referred to in 18587 as post-editing is in fact some form of translation plus revision, or simply revision done by a translator. and that there's actually no need for new terminology to describe this activity or role, but that's a point for discussion. Anyway, the unclear distinction made in 18587 between light and full post editing is also very problematic, because it turns out that light post editing is not really in demand on the market at all. So there's no contrast anymore between the two levels. And this is not a big issue anymore, but it still creates a lot of confusion when people read the standard and try to figure out what exactly is the difference between those two services or levels of post-editing that are being offered. So every 5 years, the ISO national committees have to vote on the revision, modification, or confirmation as is of a standard, any standard. This happens automatically. So the ballot for ISO 18587 ended last month. It was, I think, the end of September or 20-something. And in spite of the fact that many ISO members voted to confirm this standard, because that's always basically the easiest option when you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty, there was still a lot of opposition to this. And ISO TC 37 SC5 made an informed decision to revise the standard. And a new call for experts has been issued, and we hope to attract many good contributors this time. So this shows that the industry was aware of the fact that ISO 18587 did not reflect industry best practice, and we decided to rectify this situation, this mistake, and try to fix ISO 18587 as soon as possible. So the good news is that the revision process has now been initiated within SC5, and an improved up-to-date ISO 18587 standard will be published in the next couple of years, because the process of revision usually takes around 2 years. But the bad news is that this information is not widely known. So basically, it's very difficult to communicate with the whole market and tell them what is happening with a given with a standard. And I hope this presentation will help spread the news, and this event will help, so that any national committees, for example, which are in the process of translating ISO 18587 into their language, will take the current status of the standard into account and just postpone their publication efforts until the new version is published. And certification, which is always an interesting point, because as a requirement standard, in theory, ISO 18587 can be used for certification, and it is used for certification. There are some independent certification bodies that offer this service. As far as I know, only Bureau Veritas certification has an industry accredited. It means recognized, any formally recognized scheme, and this service is currently available in Europe and China. The Chinese part is just because it happened. There's no real justification. And in spite of the fact that this standard can be used for certification, and I've authored the certification schemes for Bureau Veritas and trained European and Chinese auditors, I have to admit that this process was really difficult and was partly ineffective because of all those issues with the standard that I've mentioned before. As for compliance and conformity, I just always make this point because there's so much strange language and basically confusing wording, and this shouldn't happen when we are talking about certification of standards, and compliance versus conformity is coming up all the time. Well, compliance is no longer a term defined by ISO or used by ISO, because it is understood as the meeting of the requirements of a regulation, an act of law. And ISO standards are voluntary, so conformity is the correct default term here. And the guidelines on conformity assessment, which is called auditing or certification audits, and which are used for certification, basically to check whether an entity can prove that they meet the requirements of a standard. This concerns an entity. an entity in theory, of course, can be many things, but within the translation industry, it would be a TSP. And this is the same situation as for ISO 17100. So in other words, it is not the translation product or the process as such, but the TSP that can undergo conformity assessment and obtain independent certification. And final points for discussion. Current industry best practice and research shows that no matter if and how machine translation is used and what sort of editing is involved or post-editing or whatever, the end product based on the source content in another language is still a translation. And the person responsible for the product remains a translator, which is an interesting terminology discussion for the future. One might also conclude that no matter if MT is used or how it's done, most clients actually want to get a translation product that is equivalent to good human translation. So that's another market fact. In the context of ISO 18587 and machine translation plus post-editing service, apart from the ongoing, of course, human translation versus machine translation, quality and whatever debate, and its practical implications, of course, money, time, and whatever. Some of the key issues that are much researched and discussed in this context include MT use-related risks. In other words, security, confidentiality, damage, liability, intellectual property rights, and so on. This, of course, comes from, this is, of course, an effect of using public machine translation engines. Business model transparency and accountability. I sort of reference this here as to admit that I'm using MT or not to admit, which basically means when I buy translation from my translators and I issue a purchase order for human translation, am I getting human translation or am I getting some form of processed augmented translation or machine translation or what? And whether we should be honest with each other about who is actually doing what and how this is done. And then we have the issue of development and or deterioration of certain professional skills. That is also subject to research. For example, post-editing versus translation skills. How does post-editing affect your translation skills if you're constantly editing machine translation output? And then, of course, also uncontrolled data sharing or mining or from whichever position you look at it, because that depends, which is something that translators are often not so much aware of. And in order to somehow wrap it up and give you some sort of an illustration of what are the issues here, I decided to sum it all up with a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, and namely in English, this quote goes, if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. And also there's this passing reference to that I quite like to TANSTAAFL, which is basically there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, which is the acronym for this old adage popularized by Milton Friedman for the purpose of explaining that there is always an inevitable opportunity cost associated with any economic decision, basically. So the point here that I'm trying to make, maybe in a sort of a roundabout way, that is that if you download or upload something to public servers, and you use data from public systems or servers, then you need to be prepared for the fact that these systems can also collect, store, and process your data. And there is no way of avoiding this. And or there are ways of avoiding it, but it's not for free. That's the point. And at the end of the day, the only question really is, are you in control of the process, or is the process in control of you? And this basically sums up a sort of relationship between the translator and a machine translation system, because this way of looking at the symbiotic and very complex relationship between a translator and the TM system illustrates the whole sort of spectrum of issues that we can be dealing with or discussing. And there's no such thing in general as a vacuum in nature. So if you take something from the system, you have to be prepared to give something back. And those are the points for discussion that I think are really valid. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive overview. As I was saying at the beginning, after each presentation, we have a Q&A session, and you are invited to type your questions in the Q&A section that you will see on the bottom of your screen. In the meantime, I do have some questions in the chat. One is about the recording of these presentations of all of the entire event. Yes, it is being recorded. Yes, it will be available on YouTube. It will be first a little bit edited and then it will be uploaded. You will be able to find it if you Google it by the title of this presentation, and you will then see on which websites it will also be published. Another question that I see here is specific for Romanian. Are there any ISO certification bodies in Romania that offer this ISO certification service? Monica, I assume that now the answer is that now the standard is being revised, and
no, it's
yes,
really complicated. Yes,
yes,
it's really complicated, because in theory there was some sort of an understanding between the Bureau Veritas national offices about this, and I think it was or was supposed to be offered in Romania. As far as I heard, I'm not sure, I'd have to talk to Vlad about this, but the Romanian National Committee was in the process of translating this standard into Romanian. So this is an interesting question now.
Yes, AFIT is indeed the organization. AFIT means the Association of Translation and Interpretation Companies in Romania. And yes, they did start to translate the ISO standard. The European Institute in Romania was supposed to revise it, but of course now there's going to be a revision of the original text. So we will see about how and when this will be available for certification in Romania and elsewhere as well. And let's see what other Q&A question do we have. Just wanted to say thanks, Monica. That was a really useful and very interesting presentation. Rich says thanks. Yes, I would like to thank you as well, because let's say that the good news is that in spite of the fact that there's going to be a delay before this ISO standard gets revised and becomes a viable product, let's say that the good news is that the result of this revision will be in line with the technological developments, with the needs of the market. It is this presentation was an overview not only of the future standard, but also of all the aspects, issues, traps, if you want, to be taken into consideration by translation service providers before they can make an offer, because before they negotiate, before they agree to an empty post-editing request from their clients. So yes, I think that I can speak on behalf of everyone and say that we can definitely use this presentation for future guidance pending the revised ISO standard, the revised 18507 ISO standard. Moving on,
exactly.
Let's see if there's anything else here. Yes, there's a new question, Monica. In an age where technology can even change in one day, wouldn't it be better if the revision held in less than 5 years in the field of translation, which is heavily related to technology, considering MT, wouldn't it be better if the revision held in less than 5 years in the field of translation? which is heavily related to technology, considering MT.
I understand the question. It's something that I struggle with. Because I would like the system to be different. I would like the system to be more sort of sensitive to what's happening on the market. Apart from the huge trap that we are facing always with a lot of different standards, where there is no actually established best practice, and then somebody starts developing those standards, and then once they start developing them, everybody has to participate, and sometimes we are not happy about the effects, and we should sometimes, you know, just take a step back and wait for this established best practice and then start standardizing, because, you know, a standard is only a standard if it actually standardizes something and people use it. Otherwise, it's just another document out there. But what you're saying here is that technology changes so fast, it would be much better to have revision, I don't know, every year or whatever. I think so too. The problem with ISO is that there's a very complicated system that we are dealing with here. And you've got all those national bodies, which are P members, which are participating members and observer members, organizations like FIT, for example, where in our industry, what happens is it's so difficult to find consensus on anything. It's so difficult to have any discussions. For example, in SC5, we have like hundreds of experts, and sometimes it's just impossible to do something fast. So it is a very bureaucratic structure, I might say. I would like the process to be much more agile, let's say, but we are trying to do what we can. And I hope that from what I said here, you will understand that this was not about nitpicking. This is about trying to figure out what went wrong and trying to figure out how it can be fixed. And hopefully we will get a lot more input from experts now. So let's just hope for the best.
Let's hope for the best indeed. And another question that popped up in the Q&A. If ISO should be based on best practice, is there an already available collection of best practices in post-editing, or research is still needed? I'm asking from the perspective of a fruitful academic, PhD, for example, for PhD research. Thank you.
If you're looking specifically at post-editing of machine translation, then I would personally read the most recent articles over the past 2 or 3 years by Sharon O'Brien. She is the biggest expert on this from the academic perspective, although she does some research that is quite practical as well. I wouldn't say that there is a totally established best practice on post-editing, because as people noted earlier, this is work in progress. This is very dynamic. But having said that, it's a question of a cart before the horse. We definitely should not be making wild guesses or trying to impose on the market our ideas of how things should be done. We should first research the market properly and see what people are doing, and then start talking about established best practice. I would say that in case of post-editing, there are some signs of best practice now. So, but let's see how the discussions go. I'm really curious about how this is going to be approached now, and we will have those big discussions on what we are going to do with the standard in June in Brussels, because we have a face-to-face meeting. But I'm also hoping that because people are listening to this, some people might think, oh, actually, I'm an expert on machine translation post-editing, and I could really contribute. And those people could join their national committees and really have some input into the final wording of the standard. This would be great. This is how it should work.
Thank you. Let's take one last question. Hope that we can discuss these aspects as we move on to the following presentations as well. You can type the questions at any time, but we need to move on as well. So it's an anonymous question. Do you have to have the certificates in order to work in the field of post-editing of machine translation or not? And if not, is there a special way into the profession? Thank you in advance. And thanks for the presentation. You were great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, certification, as I mentioned, is that's the entity that certifies. So, for example, if there's a translation company that wants to offer these services, they have a choice. They can either certify or not certify. Certification and the use of standards is voluntary. Of course, it sends a certain message to your clients and to the market if you have certification, but you don't have to have it. And especially if the standard is really awkward or difficult to be considered as a benchmark. That's always an issue. So if you're a post editor, because I have a feeling that this person is an individual translator who is thinking of moving into the field of post editing. So if you're a post editor or you want to become a post editor, basically, from my point of view, and this is a personal view now, I'm a translator, and of course I can do post editing, and there's nothing really required as long as I'm a properly qualified translator. And you don't have to certify. In fact, there aren't any certification schemes for individuals. Certification of individuals is a very, very difficult topic. It's a completely different system, and it has to be done properly. But the place where you can seek guidance and you can get training on post editing is universities. Most of the universities that I cooperate with have started post-editing programs, either as programs or they have courses as part of the translation master or any sort of translation program. A recognized one would nowadays have some sort of a module for post-editing. So this is the place to look.
Thank you. I did say we're moving on, but there's a question about money, and I think that most of the people here would be very interested in hearing the answer right now. Can the standard also propose a reasonable payment scheme for post-editing of machine translation versus human revision or versus translation in percentage, for instance?
Florin knows that, that this is not something that can be proposed in a standard. No, the standard cannot do that. But the third presentation today by Grzegorz Wójcik is going to give you some idea about this. Because there is a certain pattern. We conducted a survey. And the survey delivered a lot of interesting information because we wanted to compare the results of our survey with other data out there, with other surveys, other research. And it looks like there is a match. It looks like it all makes sense. So Grzegorz Wójcik is going to be talking exactly about this issue, among others, the practical aspects.
Thank you, Monica. So stay tuned. Moving on to the next presentation, technologies that support the use of ISO standards and certification aspects of ISO 18507. Am I losing the connection? Sorry. Aspects of ISO 18587. This is by Peter Reynolds. Peter Reynolds is a co-CEO at MemoQ, where he has worked as an executive since 2010. Mr. Reynolds has previously worked at Idiom, Berlitz GlobalNet, Bound Global Solution, and Lionbridge. He has been actively involved in the development and promotion of standards for over a decade. He's been the conveyor of the ISO TC37, SC5, and WG1 working group, which deals with translation. He's the Irish expert to ISO CE, and he's been an expert since 2008. He's the liaison representative of OASIS to TC37 and deputy chair of the Irish ISO TC37 Mirror Committee. He holds a Bachelor of Science and an MBA degree from Open University and is a localization and translation industry veteran. Mr. Reynolds is the author of several publications on industry technology and standards and has presented at all the leading industry conferences, LocWorld, TechCom, ATA, TM Europe, ATC, and of course the forums and workshops, the Translating Europe forums and workshops of the European Commission, as well as the MemoQ Fest and other events. Mr. Reynolds, you have the floor.
Thank you. What I want to do in this presentation is to look at how technology can help you with ISO 18587. I'm going to look at how CAT tools, and in this case, I'm using the example of MemoQ because I know that best, but I'm going to just show some of the ways that technology is mentioned in the standard and how you can deal with that. Thank you for the introduction. As Carmen mentioned, I'm co-CEO at MemoQ. Quick warning before we go through anything. This standard, as Monica was mentioning, they started work on it in 2012 and it was published in 2017. And the standard seems to envisage a process where the whole document would be machine translated and then would be post-edited. Well, with changes to machine translation, particularly the introduction and the the common use of Euro machine translation, that has changed greatly. With previous versions of machine translation, errors in the text, in the output text would be obvious. With Euro machine translation, the error can be there where it can be a complete mistranslation, but it usually looks perfect. So you need to see the source and target text side by side in order to spot the error. Monica mentioned how the standard is structured, and I'm going to use the same process of looking at the pre-production, the production, and post-production for how to deal with technology. The pre-production looks at a couple of things. One of them is the source content suitable for MT? And this is something where it's less of a problem than previously, but what most people that are doing a lot of MT work do is that their machine translation engines constantly get updated from their translation memories and other texts. So the better the domain that's used to train the MT engine, the better the quality of the machine translation. The other thing mentioned in the pre-production is an idea of pre-editing, and this is something that's probably no longer used. But when technologies such as rule-based machine translation were used, they often use what's called controlled source language, and they have in Annex C a reference to this. And there's a lot of useful advice there, but it's not really something that's a big issue these days. The other thing mentioned in the pre-production is the client TSP agreement, and that will often specify what technology you use, etc. So the main part of this from the technology perspective is production. And in this, I'll deal with machine translation and formatting, terminology, and the quality assurance process. And I show how the CAT tool deals with that. MemoQ, like many CAT tools, has got a number of machine translation engines which you can connect to the tool and use within the tool. There's something like 22 plugins for machine translation engines in MemoQ, and I think some of the other tools such as Strata Studio have that number too. How these work is you go to the company who's providing the machine translation, you sign up, sometimes you'll have to pay, sometimes you don't, but you'll get a code or a username and password from them, and you put that into the tool to configure the plugin. And then what happens when you're typing, the plugin works in exactly the same way as the translation memory works. It's also possible certainly with MemoQ, and I presume also with other tools, to have a machine translation concordance search, where instead of searching translation memories, you're searching a machine translation memory, and then you're seeing how possible uses of the terms that you want. And it can be of great use when there isn't a lot of exact matches coming back. Formatting is mentioned in the standard as a very important thing to do during the production process. But really with a modern CAT tool, that's not an issue. The CAT tool will just look after the formatting. And the way the text is formatted will be very similar to the source document. Terminology is, again, something very important, and the standard puts a lot of emphasis on terminology, which is good. Most CAT tools offer the opportunity to have terminology dealt with from within the CAT tool, and that to be managed quite effectively, and for the translator or a terminologist to add extra information. It's also possible, in the case of MemoQ, you can have a fully fledged terminology management system called QTerm. Other tools will have similar technologies. These are something that's of enormous help with the machine translation. One of the trends that we're seeing with machine translation engines is that the tools that have better access to TMs and to segments that have been curated by professional translators are proving to be the most effective tools. Quality assurance is again something that's mentioned in the standard. It's mentioned almost in one bullet point. It's something that's hugely important because you want a professional translator post-editing cannot deliver something where the quality of standard has got mistakes that are grammar or spelling mistakes. And they want to check for the numbers are right, for the locale, the punctuation's right, and whatever. And again, CAT tools will deal with this automatically. When you've gone through the production process and you've delivered the standard, when you've translated the document, the standard expects you to go through a post-production process, and there's two parts of that. One is the final verification and delivery, and in this process, you've got final checks for delivering the document. And it's often the case that what you do is just go through the QA checks so that you confirm that there's no issue with what you're delivering. The other process that's hugely important, and it's something that the ISO standard 18587 took from ISO 17100, is the importance of post-production feedback. And this is something that's essential, that at the end of the process, the customer is allowed to give feedback, which goes to the translator or the post editors and helps improve the process. And this obviously was a much shorter presentation than Monica, where I'm just showing you how the CAT tools and other technologies can support this standard. If there are any questions, I'm very happy to take them and very happy to hear any comments.
Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Indeed, if there are any questions, please, you can type them in the Q&A section. This is also a very relevant presentation, I'd say, because of course, CAT tools are here to stay, just as machine translation is here to stay. Our profession can no longer exist without the use of machine translation and CAT tools, I would say. Unless I'm missing anything from the chat, I do not see any questions in the Q&A section. So I would say let's take a short break. We are a little bit behind, but let's take a break. It's 15:46 here, so it must be 2:46 in Central Europe. Let's meet at 2:55, so 9 minutes. Let's take a 9-minute break and meet here for the following two presentations, a short coffee break. Now, technically, it would be better if you just cut your microphone and your camera rather than join again, rather than sign out and join the Zoom meeting again. So see you at 15:55 in 8 minutes now. Thank you. Hello. We are back after the short coffee break. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Again, I see that there have not been any new questions, so let's move on to the following presentation, Challenges and Practical Issues with Post-Editing of Machine Translation Output, a translation service provider perspective. In this presentation, the speaker will present the challenges and practical issues that the TSPs regularly deal with while providing post-editing of machine translation services, and it will focus on actual market practice. It is substantiated with data from a short survey that some of you have filled in, and we thank you for that. The speaker is Mr. Grzegorz Wojcik. I apologize for my pronunciation in Polish. He is the CEO of Magit Limited and a member of the board of the Polish Association of Translation Companies, our partner today, PSBT. Mr. Wojcik is a graduate of the Faculty of Computer Sciences of the Faculty of Systems Automation at the Wrocław University of Technology. In 1989, he co-founded Magit, and in the early years, he was responsible for software development and project management at the company. Since 1995, he has been the CEO and manager of Magit's localization and translation department, which focuses on projects for clients from the IT, telecommunications, medical services, and multimedia areas. Mr. Wojcik was one of the founders of Gala, and he has been on the board of the PSBT for over a decade. Mr. Wojcik, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Carmen, for introduction. Good to hear about all these details together. Okay, so I would like to share some data and conclusions from a survey on problems and practical issues related to machine translation and post-editing. they will be based on the survey which took place this month. Okay, so as I said, the survey was to focus on approach to MT and also to ISO 18587 standard. From all the participants, 70% were companies and 30% were individuals. And I don't know why, maybe because of the good PR, most of the people who took part in the survey were Romanian and Polish people. Okay, so at the beginning we focused on three consecutive years, asking for how much of the revenues came from machine post-editing in machine translation. The years were 2020, 21, and current year 22. So in the year 2020, we can see that there is a widespread of usage and acceptance of MT on the market, and about 80% of respondents have either no MT post-editing, about 41%, or very small amount of it, also 41%. Next year, let's say, okay, here we have that a bit smaller number of respondents have no or small exposition to post-editing, which in total gave us 77%. The rest is basically unchanged, and the third year in a row, 2022, here we have again slight decreased number of respondents who have no or small exposition to post-editing, 74% in total, but there is significant decrease in the number of respondents who have no contact with post-editing. In the 2020-22, we have only 14%. So that's about the revenues on the post-editing. The trends that we see is that the TSP are a bit modestly involved in MT, even if that getting bigger. We see that the percent of individual TSPs, freelance translators, is about 85%, while with companies we have only 50%, which leads us to the conclusion that maybe some of the companies do not know that they in fact have machine translation in process because they are not told by the individual translators. About charging for post-editing, it's an agreement that all participants say that they charge less for MT and post-editing, and the usual ratio was 20 to 40% less. Two respondents said that they charge more than 80% less, but I think it may be an error on their part. They understood the question oppositely. And there's what should be expected. There's less of reduction if you talk about full post-editing than light post-editing or not full one. Two previous sessions were mostly focused on ISO standard 18587, and as we see that the adoption is not very high in the market. 1/3 of the respondents have not heard about such standard. 1/4 of the respondents, just one-fourth of them have implemented it, and only 1/7 of the mentioned that they have asked, that their customers have asked about such standard and using it in the practice. Okay, so in case of MT, we can talk about the source language being suitable for MT and MT output being suitable for post-editing. With regards to source language, just 1/3 things that have in process in place to check that the source language is suitable for MT. Among them, there are about 2/3 cases when the source material is not suitable for MT. And the most common reason why the source is seen as not being suitable is the service security and confidentiality. However, it will be interesting to know how the evaluation of suitability process works, whether there are technical issues, let's say splitted segments, or rather the type of material or language characteristics that are taken into account. I see also that security and confidentiality alone should not have greater impact than in a usual process, unless we see that MT engines which are used, in fact, are not private, but only public. Now we have the quality of MT output, and half of the respondents often think that it's not suitable for post-editing. And of course, low quality is highlighted as the most common reason for that. About the process to work with MT and post-editing, we have that 2/3, about 60% of the respondents have a process to ensure the terminological consistency, and about half of them have a process for ensuring that the post-editor has a suitable education and experience. And most participants, about 81%, feel that it's not possible now to talk about the recognized industry best practices and professional requirements with regard to MT and post-editing, but they are looking to have it into the near future. CAD tools and post-editing, it was also covered in the previous section, and all for the example from MemoQ. In our findings, we have that there are two tools which together form the majority of the tools used for post-editing. They are half Trados Studio and MemoQ. A few other respondents mentioned tools once or twice, other tools, but what was kind of surprising, that about 20% did not mention any tool. And there are also single answers that each CAD tool should be okay for MT post-editing. Of course, to have a good process for post-editing, we need to have proper training and education. And only 13% of the respondents have the system to train post-editors. And 18% of the participants mentioned that they differentiate between full and light post-editing, which indeed sometimes may be not very strict. Other issues that were flagged related to MT and post-editing include unstable quality, inconsistent terminology, and also lack of qualified people to do read MT post-editing. Other issues that can be brought into attention here is that in the post-editing we have different pricing models. Some calculate the price via subjective assessment of MT quality, some by time spent, some by calculation of editing distance, whether average or per each segment separately. There are also trouble with pricing in projects where there are several types of materials, but only one MT engine is used. And there is also a frequent practice to determine the level of discount on the basis of typical MT suitability for another language pair, not the one that will be processed. Okay, that was all on my side. Very quick one. I hope it will be useful for you. Thank you for questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this survey. Of course, the sample, the respondents are not necessarily a representative sample of translators from the translation market as a whole, but I think that there are still some interesting conclusions that you draw. You mentioned that only one-fourth have implemented the ISO standard, and that only 1 in 7 respondents mentioned that the customers have asked about ISO 18507. Now it is up to us to say whether this is fortunate or unfortunate. I would say that if a quarter of the professionals who filled in the survey have already implemented the ISO standards and it is being revised, that is a rather encouraging piece of news. Let's see if we have questions. Do we have any questions? If not, I would like to thank you, Mr. Wojcik. Now, the following presentation is by Ms. Nadia Farkas, some opening remarks before that is that this presentation is of a translation engine developed by the European institutions, particularly by the European Commission, and it will illustrate with English and Romanian examples specific use cases as well as main potential pitfalls and how the post editor can deal with them. Although the last part of the presentation will indeed deal with the English-Romanian language pair, the first part of the presentation will mention this this translation engine, which is now available on the market for freelancers and for companies as well. So I think that the issues of security and confidentiality will come up again that Mr. Wojcik mentioned in the previous presentation. The speaker's bio, Nadia Farkas is the quality officer in the Romanian language translation department, DG Translation, at the European Commission. She is a graduate of modern applied languages at Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca, Romania. She later obtained her master's in specialized translation and terminology from the same university. She worked for 7 years as a freelance translator and interpreter in Romania, and then she moved to Brussels, then to Luxembourg, working as a translator for different European Union institutions. And since 2012, she has worked at the European Commission, first as a translator, and then as of 2019 as a quality officer. Ms. Farkas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It was a coincidence, the fact that Mrs. Popiolek mentioned Shannon O'Brien, because I started my presentation with based on a presentation of Mrs. O'Brien's last year at the As Lingua International Conference. She started by pondering a little bit the way the translators feel threatened, to be honest, by machine translation, and what are the paths to take in this new world. I am going to start sharing screen now.
While you share your screen, I would like to say that the last part of the presentation will not be interpreted because it contains English and Romanian examples. I would also like to thank the international audience who does not work with Romanian. They will not, of course, be able to understand that part of your presentation. So let's thank them already now and let's say
for
goodbye.
Their patience.
Yes, not for their patience,
okay.
but
okay.
for having been here today, and say goodbye in case they do not understand Romanian and will leave us before the end of this event. And I would like to briefly give the floor to Ms. Popiolek as well for concluding remarks on the part of this workshop, which, let's say, is for the entire audience of today.
Okay, sure.
Thank you, Carmen. Of course, I would like to add my thanks. And I'm so happy that everybody could be here with us today, and especially the people who contributed by asking questions, because that's one of the ways we learn from each other. And I think that we have to just mention that the first part of Nadia's presentation will be in English, right? So there might
Yes,
be.
I can confirm that.
All right. So that there might be some parts of your presentation that we can still benefit from. My problem is that I'm not sure what's going to happen if you have questions in English. Are we going to be translating or interpreting these in the Q&A section, or this is it?
Well, of course, the first part, as I mentioned, is intended for everyone, because these are general remarks about a very interesting translation, neural machine translation engine, which can be used for certain types of texts, as you will see from Nadia's presentation. So maybe, Nadia, you can stop before you start giving examples into Romanian, and we will see if there are questions from our international audience, and then we can continue with the part which is language specific.
Sure, let's do that.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was going to propose as
Very
a
good.
solution of the problem. And of course, as for summary, I think that we have said everything that's really significant on the subject. It is interesting, maybe the survey was not a huge survey, but I think it's very interesting that the data corresponds to other data that we have from the market. So I think that we have some idea of where things are going and where the pricing structures, well, more or less, what are the pricing structures in terms of the question that we had about, you know, how much less, right? To simplify things. And we also know that basically nowadays there's no viable process where you can do this. I mean, post-editing of machine translation without actually using some sort of a CAT tool or some sort of a TMS. So I think those are the takeaways that are really significant here, and it's only the middle or the beginning even of the discussion. So I think this was a really interesting session. Thank you anyway. And we hope for the PSBT that we will be able to continue our cooperation with our Romanian colleagues, and that we will have many such interesting events in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Populek. I hope so too. This is already our second time together, and I can confirm that on our behalf, we would be delighted to have you in the future for other hopefully interesting events for specialized audiences. So without further ado, stay tuned. Goodbye to those who will leave, not now, but a little bit later. And let's listen to Nadia's presentation. I can assure you that the translation and what she has to say about it is worth your time. Nadia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Carmen. I am going to start sharing screen now. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so I am going to talk to you about post-editing neural machine translation at the European Commission. As several of the speakers before me have mentioned, using public machine translation engines is often avoided for reasons of confidentiality. And of course, that was the main reason why we at the European Commission decided to develop our own machine translation engine, because we cannot draw legislation while sharing the whole process with the public before it even becomes legislation. So we have, of course, all the types of confidential documents which are not really suited for going into public domain before they're final. So for all these reasons, we started developing some years ago machine translation. It was first statistical machine translation, and from 2018 we switched to the neural machine translation, and our engine nowadays is called e-translation. I would just like to make a short remark on what Carmen had said. It is actually available for public administrations and universities in the member states upon request. So it is not really widely available to the public. Our engine, it's mainly
for
targeted.
SMEs. It is for
SMEs,
SMEs
yes,
as well.
for
So,
SMEs
so
it is.
translation
Yeah.
service providers who are companies, which are companies. Yeah.
Yes, but you need to ask for it. So yeah, you can ask for subscribe. Okay, so it's not essentially Google Translate. That's what I'm trying to say. All right. I started, as I was saying, inspired by a speech last year by Mrs. Shannon O'Brien during an international conference, and her presentation was called "Can Machines Translate?" And it was it started by pondering some issues, and I found more and more talking to people within the European institutions, but also with translators from outside, that's the feeling that our requesters have on how we use machine translation. They think that we just feed the machine with originals, and we, like machine guns, are capable using machine translation of putting out output of at increasing speed, which in fact is not true, as you all know, as future or present day professionals. For us, the impression is rather like this: are all the time under pressure to translate more, better, or more and more content while upholding a certain standard of quality. So what are the worries of translators nowadays? Increasing pressure, time and volume. So we are expected to translate more in less and less time. Of course, MT also leads to a drop in translation prices. This issue has been touched upon by the previous speakers. It is less the case for us working in public administration, of course, but that doesn't mean that we are not affected by it. And another issue that is actually creating a lot of worry for translators is the fact that post-editing indirectly improves the MT output to the point where translators start being afraid that they are going to be completely replaced by machines. As we post-edit machine translation, and we feed the engines with better and better quality text, it learns. So we are creating a new race of translators, if I may say so. So all this leads to feelings of discouragement, and Mrs. O'Brien, who is a professor at University of Dublin, is of course worried for her students and for the fact that many potential translators would stop being interested in this profession due to these facts. However, as somebody else had also said before me, this trend is irreversible. We are going to work with the machines. Then, to be very realistic, the sheer quantity of context that is being produced worldwide nowadays makes human translation of it impossible from a time point of view, but also from economic points of view. MT, and especially NMT, is presently used massively across the industry all over the world. It may be an anecdote, but I had heard of a major translation company who switched back to SMT actually, because NMT produces types of errors which are less easy to spot. So there is this company who preferred to switch to statistical machine translation because it produces more visible errors. But that's really an outlier. Most people, once they switch to neural machine translation, are very happy to stay with it. And in our particular case, as I had already described, e-translation is the tool that's best adapted to our own needs. as a message to her students, Mrs. O'Brien had said, if you can't beat them, then join them. So given that we are going to work with machine translation from now on, what we can do best is figure out ways in which to use the machine. And when I say the machine, of course, I mean all IT tools available, as effectively and efficiently as possible. So when do we use these tools to make sure that our machine translation post-editing is producing good quality? Well, we use them before, during, and after translation. Or to explain it in the words of previous speakers, pre-production, during production, and in post-production. This is how e-translation looks like. It was part of Connecting Europe program. It was developed under the Connecting Europe program, and this is how we can ask the machine to translate documents for us. It is automatically its output is automatically introduced into our workflow at the European Commission, but we can opt out if we decide that a document is not suitable for machine translation for various reasons. And I am going to give you an example later on in Romanian to show which texts are really not that suitable for machine translation. Our engine has several advanced options visible here. And namely, we can choose to have our text machine translated using the general text engine or various other engines, EU formal language, which is actually the default scenario, then Court of Justice, case law, cultural, and so on. You can see the list there. And it is indeed a great difference, depending on the type of text you're translating, of course, what type of engine you are using to translate your text. So I am going to start now with the examples in Romanian. The explanations will be in English, but I'm afraid that yes, the examples are better understood by Romanian speakers because they will be able to appreciate better the differences and the nuances. So,
shall we thank the interpreters and the international audience now?
Yes, I think it's that's the right moment to do it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the work of interpreters, especially since yeah, I've been there myself. And
yes,
yeah.
Thank you on behalf of the organizers to the interpreters. Indeed, I would also like to take the opportunity to thank all the speakers and those who have been here with us up to this moment. I hope to see you for other events in the future. I hope you have found this instructive, interesting, relevant. Of course, you are welcome to stay if you're interested in learning a little bit of Romanian. And if not, I will say goodbye right now. Ms. Popiolek, would you like to say a few words? I see that you have turned your camera on.
I turned my camera on because I would also like to thank the interpreters. I've also been there myself, so I know, especially with my presentation, what a terrific job they did and how hard it was for them. So thank you very much, and I hope to work with you soon.
Thank you. And try and look for the title of this Translating Europe workshop on YouTube. It will not be available immediately because we will be editing it a little bit, but then we will upload it and it will be available on YouTube as such and on several other relevant websites. Goodbye and thank you again to Ms. Popiolek and to all the other speakers and the interpreters.
Yes, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Nadia, acum pentru publicul nostru vorbitor de limba română, please.
Da, dacă nu mai sunt decât vorbitor de română, pot să trec pe română. Are there any more international speakers? Shall I continue in English or can I switch to Romanian?
English, please.
All right. So no problem. The first example, which is the example illustrating how important it is to choose your engine carefully, is an example of general text. It is taken from a small web page of the European Commission, and namely from a series of articles focusing on the EC representations in the member states. So you see, you have a small English text. For the fourth in our rep, meaning representations in the Spotlight series, we are transported to the Eternal City with the Rome rep, and the rep has been busy welcoming Ursula von der Leyen to Bella Italia, promoting Commission priorities on the ground, and so on. So it's a text which has a lot of metacultural references, which includes La Bella Italia, Ciao, and so on, so a bit of Italian. It also speaks of football jersey, and people who follow football know how important this is for the Italians. It also talks about the Eternal City, which is, of course, Rome. And but this simple syntagma has already all the cultural background behind it. So the formal EU text gave us what you can see here, the first translation. And this is, it's almost meaningless. So, first of all, it starts by saying a patra ediție a planurilor noastre de cercetare privind energia electrică din seria Spotlight. It has absolutely nothing to do with the original text. It didn't catch any meaning. The Eternal City, which, of course, in Romanian is Cetatea Eternă, it's translated for some reason with orașul european. Then, yeah, we have Jerseu Italian, the football. Again, something that no human translator would ever say. And the general text is slightly more comprehensible. It has at least orașul etern for Eternal City, which is at least a translation of what the original is saying, although somebody with Romanian culture would know to say Cetatea Eternă. Then it does figure out that football jersey is tricot de fotbal, not jerseu, and so on. But still, yeah, when it has a general text with a less formal language, the EU, our engine is not really the best, because of course it hasn't been trained on this type of text. Our engines is, of course, trained with our own text, which means it's very good for EU formal language, but it's a bit less performant when it comes to texts which are meant to be a little bit, let's let our hair down. But things get better, and I am going to show you now another type of text. What we can do during translation. So for now, the types of error tending to pop up from translation memories are still different from the ones that are generated by NMT. As you've seen in the previous example, you can easily spot that it's a machine translation from the first 10 words in the text. So it's clear, and you know already some of the things you need to pay attention to. Because of course we have been working a lot with translation memories, and we have experience in how to deal with them, but translating with machine translation is relatively new on the market, and so we still need to figure out exactly where to look for the errors, beside of course the very obvious ones which you've already seen in the general text. We are going to I'm sorry, I think I missed something. Yeah, from the general text, I should have taken you to legislative text, and to show you in contrast the two engines, how they work, the EU formal language and the general one. And you will notice that the texts are quite well translated with both of the engines, even if they are somewhat different. I mean, there are some differences, but both of them have quite a good they read well, they are accurate, and the differences between them are not very important. I will let you take a look at the only two places where the translations actually differ. So as you can see, our engines are quite well adapted to translating formal texts. This this takes us to what I have already mentioned, the during translation phase. And I am going to talk now about some typical errors which occur more frequently in in texts which have been translated by the machine, and which occur not necessarily never, but still far less frequently when they are translated by human translators. So we have here style errors. We have, and namely here repetition. If it is this article in English, it goes with this article, which in Romanian becomes extremely unnatural to say. Articolul respectiv se referă la contingentele tarifare, articolul respectiv prevede, articolul respectiv, and it goes on with this long phrase which for a Romanian speaker would be really extremely bizarre. What you can do to avoid such mistakes is reread the final text, which is of course part of what you should do anyway, but reread it preferably in its final format. If you just reread it in a CAT tool, such errors are easier to miss, because sometimes, as you can see here, you have footnotes. Sometimes those footnotes are going to be put immediately after the text, and you don't realize that in the final text, in Word, for example, this article respective goes on and on, one after the other. You don't see that in Studio or in MemoQ, but you do see it in Word. So that's why it's very important at the end of your translation, and when you do the revision, to read preferably generate a preview and read it in Word. So remedies I proposed for such errors is reread the final text and F8, which means the quality checks. Then it produces a lot terminological inconsistencies. As you can see, we have here checks in the same paragraph, and it's translated once as verificările de monitorizare, and the follow-up checks is done controale de monitorizare. If you keep on switching between them, it becomes unclear at some point if those are two different types of checks, or they should be the same, or it becomes more and more difficult. We have done you see another example, single document, which in Romanian, in this particular context of agri documents, is caiet de sarcină al produsului. It's a term for us, and sorry, no, that would be documentul unic. Product specification is caietul de sarcină al produsului, and it's translated just a couple of lines down, specificațiile produsului. Again, since it's a term, it's something that is a formal document. It should be obviously translated consistently, and machine translation mixes the terminology all the time. As a result, in the European Commission, we developed internally terminology checkers, so short Excel-based programs, in which we can introduce our terminology, and they know how to do the checks for languages such as Romanian or Polish, for that matter, languages which are flexionary, in which even sometimes the root of the word can change for different, for example, in dative or genitive. And these tools are really adapted to our needs, have been developed internally, and we use them consistently to check terminology, especially in very long documents. I should mention that very often in our case, documents we translate are in excess of 100 pages. So you can imagine that given the volume, it's very difficult to keep track of terminology, especially when the terminology becomes numerous. We do have term bases with tens or thousands or hundreds of terms. Another type of mistakes, which is quite typical for machine translation and sometimes is difficult to figure out by the human eyes, is the omissions, at times serious ones, and the additions. Here we are missing the register, and here we are missing the short form of the chemical name, while it saw fit for some reason to add something in the chemical name. The problem when you are checking a document like that just by reading it is that unless you are a specialist, it's quite easy to miss things like that. So again, terminology checkers are very important for us in this context. So your own attention, that's the best remedy. F8, yeah, we include our terminological checkers in the studio quality checks. One type of omission which is particularly serious and the machine translation does, and I've seen it several times, I mean, is the no. You say, do not, so the commission does not something, and the machine translation forgets the no. So resulting, of course, in the opposite meaning. You want to be really careful with that. And yeah, another type of error that machine translation makes, and that's of course a source of a lot of humor between translators, among translators, is the pure inventions like these ones. We have chromitors, which are of course minereuri de cromit. For some reason, the machine changed it into crofit, which means nothing. But yeah, the real hilarious one is the following one. The minerals found within the Indonesian mining jurisdiction in the form of natural resources as blessings of God Almighty are national wealth of the Indonesian people, says the Indonesian law, translated into English. At which the machine translation tells us, orice minereuri găsite în jurisdicția minieră indoneziană sub formă de resurse naturale, întrucât sângerarea lui Dumnezeu Almighty reprezintă bogăție naturală a poporului indonezian și prin urmare sunt controlate și utilizate. These are easier to spot because they're so hilariously meaningless and ridiculous that yeah, it's not so difficult to spot them. And as a result, even reading the text even diagonally, yeah, they are quite they catch the eye, and also of course a spell checker helps in such situations. For example, here Dumnezeu Almighty would have been caught, of course, by a spell checker, the Almighty, and then you could have read more carefully the whole phrase. Crofit also was something that was caught by the spell checker. Where we need to pay special attention to in this context is the names, and especially the names of organizations and businesses. It does tend to insist on translating them, and so sometimes you don't even realize when it translated or it tried to adapt to Romanian an English name or even more a Spanish name or a German name or whatever, and yeah, at some point you risk not knowing what you're talking about anymore. So you want to be very careful when you deal with names and of people and organizations. After translation, Well, fight fire with fire. So what the machine, when the machine produces problems, you can use the machine to sort out some of those problems. So we use a lot the automatic checks, the QA tools. Besides the classical spell checker, which you have in any CAD tool, but you also have in Word or in most tool nowadays, really. We use a lot the QA checker. I must say, I'm not sure if I already mentioned that we use Trado Studio. Right now, that's the yeah, that's our
translation software.
Yeah, right. Thank you, Carmen. So besides these two tools, spell checker and QA checker, which are included in any CAD tool, really, we have developed some internal quality checks, and one type of them is the terminology checkers, which are adapted to the fractionary languages. We included all these in the automatic checks in Studio, and the other one is the so-called Ruby checker, which checks numbers. It checks dates and all sorts of figures, and so everything to deal with numbers. And in our particular context, all these automated checks can be general or project specific, especially obviously the terminological checker that needs to be project specific. You adapt the terminology to the text you are using, but also sometimes even the QA checker or the spell checker can be adapted for particular needs. A fair warning: the quality control tools do not correct, they just spot and draw attention to potential errors. One problem is the so-called false positives. When using automatic checks, sometimes the tool would identify as errors things that are not errors, and that risk discouraging translators from using them if one particular tool produces more noise like that. So what you can do in such cases is reach out to the IT people or to people who can help you to update or ask for an update of those tools, as they are all adaptable, obviously, and it's important that that you do not just give up on them. And even in cases of extreme emergency, it's essential to make time to read the text in its final format. It's if there isn't time for a complete read, well, this is something that applies for practitioners of translation focused on the most sensitive parts. In our specific context, in the European institutions, the most sensitive parts are, of course, the enacting terms for legislation, titles or subtitles, or for example, if you translate publicity materials, you want to make sure that the slogans are perfect. And you also have to be wary of the fact that some errors are not detectable by merely reviewing the text. So things such as omissions, they are easily missed unless they are visible because the text doesn't make sense. But otherwise, if you drop a no somewhere, unless it doesn't make logical sense anymore, you could easily not spot it. So it's important to actually revise, not just review, and I'm making this difference between reviewing, which means reading the text in only the target language, and revising, which means reading both the original and the target text. Things that inspired me, yes, were in our particular case, in our specific context, EULearn is our training platform. I took a look at computer-aided quality checks, which helped me deal with that. Of course, e-translation. ASLING is the international organization dealing with language and technology, where Shannon O'Brien, Mrs. O'Brien, was invited last year to hold the presentation I was telling you about, and also a very interesting guide called A Short Guide to Post Editing by Jean Nitzke and Sylvia Hansen-Shira. I presented the number ISBN number there in case you're interested. So if you want to further read or check on how MT is doing nowadays and how it can be used and what problems it poses for us and how we deal with them. And when I say us, I mean professional translators in all professional contexts. These are some suggestions. Thank you very much. And now, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer.
Yes, thank you, Nadia, for this very interesting and I would say relevant presentation, even for those of us who do not speak Romanian, because the Romanian examples were illustrations of, let's say, universal issues that we deal with as translators, as post-editors, because technology is here to stay. We're using machine translation for most types of texts, and indeed the skills that are needed to post-edit the machine translation output are different. They are a combination between translation skills and revision skills, although it's worth mentioning maybe that all translators in the European institutions are also revising texts. So the texts, for most of them, and as far as the deadlines and our workload allows it, are being seen by at least two pairs of eyes, two pairs of translating of linguists' eyes, a translator and a reviser. Ideally, it should happen, of course, and it happens sometimes on the private market, sometimes it doesn't happen. So this is why I think your presentation is very interesting and very relevant for all those who want to make sure that they do not miss or they do not fall in any of the pitfalls of the new, let's say, era of translation. I do not see any questions right now in the Q&A. So I think it is safe to assume that there are, okay, one popped up. How do you decide whether a text is suitable for e-translation or not? Have you any procedure to follow for this?
We have in our workflow the so-called workflow managers, who are either head of units or stand-in for head of units, and they see the text. They actually open the documents and take a look at them before working, and then each translator is further on free to decide whether they want to use machine translation or not. Sometimes you decide by applying machine translation and then realizing that the effort for post-editing is so large that it's not worth it, and then you just discard it and start anew.
Yes, so that I think that's the answer for somebody who does not work for the European institutions. That you just do it. You
just take a look at the text.
Yes, you just upload the text into a neural machine translation engine, and then you look at the result, and then you decide for yourself whether you want to start from scratch or use that output and post-edit it.
A rule of thumb I heard from somebody was that if you read the first phrase and you realize that you need to read it a second time because you didn't get anything from it, then it's probably not good. Or if you need to start immediately changing everything, that probably the quality is not good enough to be worth it.
Second, or a follow-up question, are there other errors, for instance, offensiveness in the neural machine translation? I heard about it, but is it relevant now? I heard about offensiveness.
Honestly, I'm not sure I am well placed to answer about offensiveness. Our engines are specifically trained to root out anything that's offensive. I mean, really offensive language. So I've never come across anything like that. And from what I know, even the public engines such as, I don't know, Microsoft or Google Translate, they do root out offensive language. Now, of course, we need to perhaps to clear our terminology. What do you mean by offensive? If you mean really bad words, swear words and stuff like that, I think they are rooted out.
Yes, indeed. We have to understand whether you refer to swearing or maybe to something that might culturally offend somebody. But that again is about human intervention. It is about your skills as a professional. It's your job to make sure that they're not being offensive, because of course the machines are trained to help you with it, but they are machines. There's no filter. There's no human brain filtering the input. That the machine gets, the text that you are then post-editing. There is no there are only automatic filters, and I guess that is your job to look at this.
If I may offer a small comparison, imagine that the machine translation is like a 4-year-old child repeating everything you've said in the house. If you train it on swear words, it's going to repeat swear words. If you train it on just legal text, it's going to repeat legal text. So it's very much like that. It depends on what types of text and you train it on.
More follow-up. I suppose you only deal with full post-editing, or are there any cases of light post-editing for the EU institutions?
Well, we deal with full post-editing, yes. It did happen once in a particular circumstance where we had to translate thousands of pages in a matter of, I don't know, days, when we did use light post-editing, but that was a very special circumstances, and which we do hope it won't repeat again. It was in a moment of crisis. I'm not going to name it, but yeah, you can imagine that lately has been no shortage of crises on our hands. So no, light post-editing is not part of our workflow. We do full post-editing.
Or if I may add, we either do full post-editing or no editing at all. You will see that on some of the European Union websites, web pages, you will see a note that this page is being automatically translated. So indeed, the workload is so high that we cannot possibly humanly, even with all the technology behind us, cover everything. But we do want to keep it multilingual. We do want to keep it accessible in all the 24 official languages of the European Union. So for those pieces of content where full post-editing is not possible, there is full machine translation, and the readers see that it's that particular
they have a
piece
disclaimer.
Is automatically translated.
A good example is the site, the EC site Reopen EU. You know probably that in the context of the COVID pandemic, on the EU pages, you could find on the Reopen EU guidelines regarding each country in the European Union, and the rules there were for traveling to and from that country, the rules for transiting, and so on. That was a site which changed daily. The information was quite a huge amount, and it came at a moment where we were swamped with other political documents. So that's an example of what Carmen was mentioning. It was fully machine translation. Sometimes at the beginning, especially with not always best results, but it was understandable, and it carried a disclaimer saying this is machine translation, it hasn't been revised by a human. So yeah, we offer it so you can figure out what you need to do, but it's not perfect.
And another follow-up question, is there a role for us as translators or linguists to work on neural machine translation engine development, apart from giving feedback, which is the result of post-editing?
Yes, there is another profession, let's say, or another specialization for linguists in natural language processing, and such linguists do take part in working. I mean, work in teams developing translation engines. Of course, these translation engines aren't just programmed by IT people. They always work together with linguists in developing machine translation. So yes, there is a part for everyone. If you're interested in that, I think there are several universities in Europe offering specialization in natural language processing and in various other things related to machine translation, and you can look up the type of work you can do. But yes, you can work on machine translation engine development.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the questions, and thank you very much for your answers. Thank you very much for your presentation, Nadia. If there are no other questions, yes, what do you think about the future of translators?
I think that the translators, just like most other professions, are going to work further on with the machine at hand all the time. From what I see, the machine translation is becoming better and better, but I also do see that in order to catch up with all the cultural background and feeling that we translators often put into our translations, even in more formal context, I'm not sure that's going to happen within our lifetimes. So I think there are going to continue to be translators, but I think the way we work is changing and is going to continue to change. I believe we're going to work more and more with, obviously with machines, and I think we are going to need IT skills more and more because we will need at some point to be able to tweak our IT instruments by ourselves when we need it. So not rely all the time on somebody else, on an IT specialist to do it for us. So I think digital skills are extremely important too for translators as well as for any other profession, really.
And if I may add, if you would like to have a look at what the European Union thinks about the skills of a 21st century translator, you might want to Google the European Masters in Translation Framework for Translators. This is a document that has been drafted by specialists in the language fields for the universities which want to have master's programs that have a quality label granted by the European Commission. So in that document, you will have a very comprehensive, I would say, view of all the skills that a translator needs nowadays. And it's about translation, it's about culture, the languages of the countries, but also the cultures of the countries where people speak the languages into which you translate. So cultural skills, but as well as technological skills, interpersonal skills. You need to know how to sell yourself. And I think that Ms. Popolek's presentation gave us a very good idea of what we need to think of before we submit an offer or before we accept a project as translators working in the private market. So also intercultural and interpersonal skills. You need to know how to sell yourself, and whatever you know, whatever you're doing, you need to know how to sell it. So
Carmen,
yes,
I think it would be the easiest if you were to type the name of the document.
Of course.
Mrs. Novacek is asking for the name of the document.
I will type it. So it's
I would just add while Carmen is typing the name of the document that I would also recommend specialization, meaning find some fields that are interesting for you or where you're really good at or you have a hobby in, and try to translate in those fields which are more specialized, which have perhaps a specific language, and these type of of knowledge is very highly appreciated. We, for example, at the European Commission, we translate from basically all the fields that we legislate into, and we do have colleagues here who translate, but have a double specialization, such as some are engineers, some are doctors. When you translate, for example, legislation in the medical field, it helps a lot to have a doctor on your hands who can actually understand the context and translate properly and with a specific language. So also technical, if I may say, specialization is very important. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to become a nuclear inspector, but it's good to read on specific subjects more than and have at least a background knowledge of the specific subjects you work into. I think specialized translators are more and more sought after, especially because, as you can see, machine translation for now, it's mixing terminologies from all sorts of fields, and it risks producing ridiculous things. So I think that's also a good thing to keep in mind.
I totally agree, and thank you for that. And another follow-up question, is there or should there also be a higher focus on the linguistic competence in the post-editing era? Higher as compared to what?
If you ask my personal opinion, I would highly recommend linguistic competence at as high a level as possible, because I find that if we start to pre-edit our texts to sort of dumb them down for the machine to understand, we risk at some point losing the faculty of thought. We human, we think in words. If we are incapable of using more than 500 words, or we become incapable of imagining the world in more than 500 words. And I think that's a real risk, a societal risk, if you want, not just cultural risk. So I would think that, yes, linguistic competence, and I mean by that linguistic competence, first of all, in your own mother tongue, is very important. So read as much as possible.
Thank you, Nadia. Of course, this is a question that any of the speakers can answer to, like all the other questions, as a matter of fact, because I see that all the speakers are still here. So you have the floor. Anybody who wants to say something has the floor.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to monopolize the discussion. If there are other opinions or other ideas, please, by all means.
No, of course, it was not our intent to do this. Okay, so I think that we can wrap it up. Yes, I would like to once again thank all the speakers, first and foremost, for their valuable expertise. I want to thank the interpreters who have helped us understand each other, and I would like to, last but not least, thank all of those who have stayed so far. We have an international audience still. Ms. Populek?
Hi, yes, it was a very interesting presentation. I did not pitch in with the Q&As because basically those are really difficult questions. I agree
Yes.
with I agree with Nadia. You know, it is a bit of a philosophical discussion, and also there's also the question, you know, of terminology. Maybe we, as translators, we will not become extinct, but maybe we will be called something else. I mean, I questioned the need for terms that are not really necessary. When you have a reviser, why do you need a post editor if basically we are performing the same tasks, right? But I think no matter what we are called, I think that some sort of central role within this augmented reality will still be needed, and we will retain that role. So I think that we can be quite optimistic about the future.
If I may just add something to that, I've heard of a new profession called cultural mediators, because yes, if you can translate with your smartphone, you need something more than just somebody to put words into another language. You need a cultural mediator. So perhaps that's where the translation profession is heading to.
Yes, our linguistic translator essence is going to prevail.
Definitely. I think literary translation. I mean, in literature, I've just returned from one of the largest festivals of literature and translation in Iași, in Romania. Literary translation is still something that's mainly destined to human sensitivity, and to it's of course impossible to translate if you have a text full of metaphors and of hidden meanings and puns and other literary literally forms of expression. Think of poetry. This is also this is particularly another field where a human brain is absolutely necessary, and the machine will, as Nadia said, at least not in our lifetime, be able to replace us. But there are other types of texts where human eye plays a more important role than in certain specialized texts. So do not worry about the future of our profession. It's here to stay. Even if we will no longer be called translators, even if our services will diversify, because we will offer translation or post-editing services or revision, or depending on what role the technology will play. We need people who speak more than one language. It will not be a field where machine can do it all. That being said, thank you very much, and I hope to see you very soon in another interesting event. Thank you, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.